Hello, and welcome to another episode of ADHD History, the history of the world told in no particular order. I'm your host, Xander Millette, here to share some more fascinating historical tales with you all. First off, I want to apologize for my overly long absence. I just got back home after a summer-long internship that took way more of my free time than I thought it would. And since I was still doing classes online during it, I barely had time to keep myself fed, let alone write scripts and record them. But I'm back now, and I hope everyone is ready to listen to some more cool stuff. For today's episode, we're going on a journey through the annals of papal history, peeling back the layers of time to uncover the lives and legacies of some of the most eccentric and enigmatic figures to ever sit upon the throne of St. Peter. From scandalous affairs to bizarre behaviors, the papacy has seen its fair share of colorful characters throughout the centuries. The line between saintly virtue and sinful excess often blurs, and the halls of the Vatican have echoed with the tales of intrigue, scandal, and outright absurdity. From the rule of the harlots to the warrior pope, from debauched banquets to exhumed corpses, the history of the papacy is as rich and varied as it is surprising and unsettling. I've got a bunch of popes to tell you about, so let's start off with the legend of Pope Joan, the woman who may or may not have been pope in the 9th century. The legend of Joan first appeared in the 13th century and was told over and over again, and details vary. A Dominican friar named Martin of Tropau is considered to have written the definitive version of the story. The basics of it are that she was either a German girl named Joan or an English girl named Agnes, who sought to educate herself, so she disguised herself as a man and traveled to Athens to be a monk with a male lover posing as her guard. Later, she moved to Rome, still with her lover, and became a distinguished orator, with Romans turning out in droves to hear her speak. She was unanimously elected pope around 855 and took the name John VII or VIII. Unbeknownst to the people, however, Joan was pregnant. This was discovered during her procession when she gave birth trying to mount her horse. One story says that she was immediately bound to the back of the horse and dragged through the streets whilst being stoned by the crowds, and was buried where she finally died. Popes after her never used that street again for processions. Another says her lover squirreled her away to a secret location where she died of shame and grief. Yet another said that she was deposed for her deception, became a nun, and lived to see her son become Bishop of Ostia.
Good for her.
There is actually a street in Rome that popes avoided, though I don't know if they still do. Apparently there was a statue of a woman in papal vestments with an infant in her arms on the straight road near St. Clement's, said to be the spot where Pope Joan gave birth. The statue is mentioned in guidebooks of Rome sold throughout the Middle Ages. Some have suggested that the real reason they didn't use the street is because it was too narrow. Pope Sixtus V had the street widened and the statue was removed, though there is a similar statue in the Vatican Gardens. The Middle Ages are full of stories of women who, for various reasons, dressed up as men and confined themselves to abbeys and monasteries. Saint Marina joined a monastery disguised as a man to stay with her father. An innkeeper's daughter accused her of rape and subsequently fathering her baby. Marina didn't reveal her birth gender and was ejected from the monastery. She raised the baby outside the gates until the prior took pity and allowed them back into the fold. Her true gender was only revealed after her death, and the innkeeper's daughter was proven a liar. Saint Theodora had a very similar story. She was the wife of Gregory, prefect of Alexandria. She cheated on him and ran away in disguise to a monastery. Again, a woman accused her of being the father of her baby. She quit the monastery and adopted the child. After bringing the child up, he grew up to become an abbot, she went back into the monastery, where her true sex was also discovered after her death. There are many other stories, and honestly, I might do an episode about transgender saints at some point. I used female pronouns for Marina and Theodora because that's how the sources refer to them, but they themselves probably didn't identify as such. But I'll get into that at some point. We were talking about Pope Joan. Anyway, the legend of Pope Joan is almost definitively fake. The times when she was supposed to be on the papal throne have lots of evidence that other male popes were reigning. Joan's legend seems to have been inspired by another woman. Her name was Marozia, and she will be talked about in depth through the next few popes I'm going to discuss. I talked a bit about our next pope, Pope Stephen VI, in my Charlemagne episode, but I will gladly talk about him again. After Pope Formosus died of a stroke, he was succeeded by Boniface VI, but he was only on the throne for 15 days before dying of either gout or poison. He would be replaced by Stephen VI, a longtime rival of Formosus. In 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered that the tomb of Formosus be opened up and his body exhumed. He charged the corpse with breaking canon law, perjury, and illegally serving as bishop. This was the Cadaver Synod. The decaying body was propped up onto a throne, and a trial was held, with Stephen acting as prosecutor. While Stephen tossed allegations at Formosus, the accused remained silent, as one might hope a corpse would be. In the middle of the trial, an earthquake shook the room, but Pope Cuckoo Pants persisted with his case, and the dead pope was found guilty of usurping the papacy. Stephen VI declared all his acts as pope null and void. All consecrations, all appointments, all ordinations were undone. His body was stripped of its papal vestments, and 3 of his fingers were cut off from his right hand, the fingers of benediction. Finally, the body was tossed in the Tiber River. However, the next day it was recovered by some monks and secretly buried in a monastery. The people of Rome said, "Enough of this loon," and formed a mob, imprisoned Stephen, and he died soon after because someone snuck in and strangled him. The next pope, Romanus, overturned all the actions of Stephen VI, but he was soon overthrown himself and confined to a monastery for the rest of his days. The next guy, Pope Theodore II, was pope for about 20 days, just long enough for him to recover Formosus' body. Nobody seems to know how he died, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if foul play was involved. Finally, Pope John IX had him reburied in St. Peter's Cathedral, where he remains to this day and hopefully still silent. Now, if that wasn't enough drama for you, here's what was going on behind the scenes. The Duchess of Spoleto, a woman named Agiltruda, led an army against Rome and seized it in 894. The Holy Roman Empire Arnulf took exception to this, and with Pope Formosus at the head of his army, drove her back to Spoleto. After Formosus died, Boniface VI was elected, and allegedly Agiltruda had him poisoned. She seized Rome again and had Stephen VI elected. She was an observer at the Cadaver Synod. She brought with her to the trial a 6-year-old girl named Marozia. 36-year-old Cardinal Sergius was also at the trial and made eye contact with Marozia and allegedly formed a bond with her. After Pope Stephen died, Agiltruda, pissed off once more, seized Rome yet again and installed Pope Romanus, allegedly killed him off after 4 months, and installed Pope Theodore. He too died an early mysterious death.
Don't be suspicious.
By 904, there had been 8 popes in as many years. At this time, there was no emperor in Rome. The city was run by a man named Theophylact, who was the commander of the militia and financial director of the Holy See. More importantly, he was the husband of a woman named Theodora, and the father of Marozia. Theodora was responsible for a couple of popes being elected, but they were followed by a man named Sergius. 15-year-old Marozia, who had, you remember, first met Sergius as a 6-year-old, became his mistress. Sergius's pontificate lasted 4 years and left Marozia with a son. The son would be Pope John XI, but he's not important to this episode. Marozia wasn't his only underage mistress, and he was known for his liaisons, as well as his alleged arrangements for the murders of his predecessor Leo and the antipope Christopher. It is often said that the winners write history, which isn't good if you're the underdog. Even worse is when your enemies write history. Most scholars agree that overall, Sergius III was a bad pope in power at a bad time in the history of the Roman Church. But it doesn't help that his story comes mainly from Liutprand of Cremona. Liutprand was a bishop of Cremona, diplomat, and historian. His work, Antipodicis, The Revenge in English, was about the evil deeds of King Berengar II and his wife Willa, whom Liutprand called the second Jezebel. He wrote it to present a specific historical perspective, including damaging the reputations of certain politicians and religious leaders. Liutprand did not write about the politics of Rome or the papacy in a favorable light. What horrified Liutprand of Cremona, and later scholars through the 16th and 19th centuries, was that Theodora, the wife of Count Theophylact, ruled with her husband and elected popes with him. These scholars looked down on female authority and called the administrative structure in Rome a pornocracy. In a pornographic state, the government is in the hands of prostitutes and corrupt officials. The regime was also referred to as the heterocracy, or rule of courtesans. For example, Theodora was called a shameless whore by Liutprand of Cremona and accused of ruling like a man. Liutprand accused the couple's daughter, Marozia, as a harlot. Marozia became the head of the family after her parents and, for a time, became all-powerful in Rome and ruled over the papacy. If we believe the stories about her, she had a child with Pope Sergius who also became pope. 2 of her grandsons later became pope. 2 great-grandsons and 1 great-grandson also became pope. A whole dynasty of popes. Outside the pages of Liutprand of Cremona, there only exist vague mentions of her personality. Fierce, corrupt, vengeful, but also highly competent and intelligent. Liutprand fills in some of the details, but ignores the rest. His motives for painting Marozia in the darkest possible colors are obvious. She was a Roman, and she was the grandmother of that pope who gave endless trouble to Liutprand's beloved master, the Emperor Otto. Indeed, she was the ancestress of a line of popes who defied the emperors of the West. Marozia was married off to Alberic I of Spoleto in 909. The son of the supposed union between the Pope and Marozia was born in 910, a year after the wedding, so Sergius was most likely not the father. On the other hand, it is bizarre that as the eldest son of a noble family, Pope John joined the church and the younger brother, Alberic II, became the Duke of Spoleto. Usually, the eldest son took the title, while the younger one had a career in the church. This arrangement implies that the family knew John was illegitimate and probably fathered by Sergius. What is true and what is not is uncertain, since it's difficult to prove paternity 1,200 years later. Apart from an alleged affair with a teenager, murdering other popes, and the scandal surrounding Formosus, Sergius's reign was uneventful. He died peacefully on the papal throne on April 14, 911, and was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. History has neglected Sergius's other official duties because saucy stories survive better. His most famous achievement is that he had the Lateran Basilica rebuilt after it collapsed in the earthquake in 896, the same earthquake that supposedly hit Rome during the trial of Pope Formosus. Antipope Christopher, Sergius's predecessor, had plundered the basilica. Sergius had new objects, pictures, and crosses placed in the church and had its walls decorated with frescoes. Sergius also rebuilt the monastery in Nonantola that the Hungarians had destroyed, invested money in churches that the Muslims had looted, and founded monasteries and churches in the kingdom of the Franks. But who's interested in those kind of stories? Anyway, back to Marozia. She was married to Alberic of Spoleto to keep him in her family's control, but in Marozia's hands, he turned from a threat into a real danger. She persuaded her husband to attack Rome, but the coup failed and Alberic was killed. When her mother Theodora died, Marozia had the current pope imprisoned and allegedly poisoned, and allegedly did the same with his successor. Finally, her son took the papal throne in 931. Marozia also got married again for the 3rd time to her brother-in-law Hugo. It's unclear if he was the brother of her first husband, Alberic, or brother of the second. Anyway, her son Alberic II did not like Hugo and led an armed mob against the Castel San Angelo after being allegedly punched in the face by his new stepfather. Hugo managed to escape and allegedly hidden in a basket and dressed in his nightshirt. But Alberic caught his mother and brother and imprisoned them both. He later let his brother out to resume his papal duties, but he was kept under house arrest in the Lateran Palace. Marozia, allegedly, was kept prisoner in the basement of Castel San Angelo for the next 54 years. The story goes that in 986, Pope John XV sent a bishop to the now 94-year-old Marozia to exorcise any demons she still had, and then had her killed by suffocations for her crime, as well as those of her grandson. A hell of an end for poor Marozia. Octavian, the son of Alberic II and the grandson of Marozia, was born around 937 and was named for his father's pride and Rome's past. Around 954, when Alberic was roughly 40 years old and had been ruling Rome for 20 years, Alberic caught a fatal fever. The story goes that he had himself carried to the altar above the tomb of St. Peter and had the leading Roman nobles brought in to swear on the bones of the apostle that after he died, Octavian would be the next prince of Rome, and after the current pope died, they would elect Octavian as the next pontiff, making both offices once again the role of one person. Octavian became Pope John XII, and he was not a good choice. John saw the city as a treasury to be plundered. Rome lacked a middle class which, in other Italian cities, brought about the limited democracy of the later centuries. There were no merchants to create wealth and act as a buffer between the nobles and regular people, since Rome's chief income came through the production of priests and the exploiting of pilgrims. John used the money to maintain his own armed gangs. They proved useless against outside enemies, but were good enough to terrorize Romans. In his relationship with the church, John seems to have been a Christian Caligula, whose crimes were particularly horrific considering the office he held. He was fond of gambling, allegedly invoking old Roman gods at his games. His sexual hunger was insatiable, and the occupants of his bed were rewarded not with gold, but with land. One of his mistresses was able to establish herself as a feudal lord. After reigning for 3 years, the new king of Italy arose. His name was Berengar, and he had fought his way to power by the usual means of murder and treachery. John XII promised the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor to King Otto of Germany and had him crowned in Rome, swearing to give no support to Berengar. But John then started negotiating with Berengar's son, Adalbert, who almost as soon as Otto left Rome. He also negotiated with the Huns and the Byzantines. Why? No one knows, but my best guess is that John loved chaos for chaos's sake.
So far, so good.
Otto sent an envoy to John, our old friend Liutprand of Cremona. Liutprand got no satisfactory answers out of John as to why he was doing what he was doing, and returned to Otto. Otto then learned that Adalbert was in Rome, about to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor too. So Otto marched on Rome. John grabbed whatever treasure he could and fled with Adalbert to Tivoli. Otto then convened a synod of about 100 churchmen to discuss the charges against John. Otto opened the synod saying that he regretted that John neglected to attend.
Why must you fail me so often?
Charges included that John had ordained a bishop in a stable, and when called out on the inappropriateness of this by a bishop, he had that bishop castrated, as well as had sex with nuns, drunk wine to Satan's health, and committed many acts of adultery and blasphemy. John was sent a letter demanding he attend the synod and answer for the charges. He responded with a letter basically saying that he would excommunicate them if they tried to replace him, and that they had no power to ordain a new pope or perform mass. A second letter was sent to John, but he didn't reply. Instead, he had gone off hunting. The synod found John guilty and deposed him, electing Leo VIII in his place. This pissed the Romans off. If the Romans had been allowed to elect a new pope, they would have forgotten about John quick enough. Instead, the Romans saw one of their own, the Prince of Rome no less, being overthrown by a German foreigner. The Romans rose in revolt, but they weren't very organized and they were put down quickly. But Otto couldn't remain in Rome forever, and as soon as he left, John came back. He excommunicated Leo VIII and went about punishing the clergy who had voted against him. One was flogged, another had a hand cut off, a third had 2 fingers, his nose, and his tongue cut off. Real forgiving guy, that John.
God, what a jerk.
Otto was still fighting Berengar and Adalbert and couldn't come back immediately. But when he was finally free to return, the army was marching to Rome when news reached them of John's death. The gossip in Rome said that a husband had caught Pope John in bed with his wife, and, pissed off about this, smacked John in the head with a hammer. And John died of the wound 3 days later. Leo VIII was put back on the papal throne, and when he died, John XII's son, John XIII, became pope. He wasn't as bad as his dad, but he was still pretty bad. He was also condemned as an adulterer, and said to have also died at the hands of an enraged husband. Like father, like son. Next, we come to Pope Benedict IX, the man who would be pope 3 times. Now, I don't know how old he was when he became pope. Some sources say he was 20, and others say he was 12. The first time he was pope was from 1032 to 1044, quite a length of time in those days. He was the nephew of the previous pope, John XIX, and had obtained the throne because his dad bribed the Romans. Lots of stories exist about Benedict. He was in league with demons and books of magic were found in his palace. He was lusty and used his infernal powers to get women into his bed. He was rumored to be bisexual, but his predilections leaned mostly towards men. He was said to throw gay orgies in the Lateran Palace and engaged in bestiality. Unfortunately, all we have on Benedict is bits and pieces from multiple accounts, as he didn't have a dedicated biographer. Even one that wrote BS because of grudges like Liutprand did would have been nice. Benedict was kicked out of Rome in 1044, and Sylvester III was elected to replace him. But Benedict came back a few months later and kicked Sylvester out. After a couple months, Benedict apparently got tired of it all and wanted to marry his cousin. So he sold the papal throne to his godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI. But once again, he changed his mind and came back to Rome, taking the city and the throne. But Gregory VI was still recognized as the true pope. So then there were 3 popes: Sylvester III, Gregory VI, and Benedict IX. Emperor Henry III came to Rome and convened the Council of Sutri in 1046, declaring Sylvester and Benedict deposed, and made Gregory resign since he had bought the papal throne and hadn't been elected. Clement II was chosen to succeed, but when he died, Benedict came right on back and took the throne again. He had to be chased out yet again and was officially excommunicated. Not much is known of him after that. We do know for certain that he's buried at the Abbey of Grottaferrata near Rome. According to the abbot, he was repentant in his last days and regretful of the sins he had committed. Next up, we've got Pope Urban VI, a man whose papacy was like a roller coaster ride through the twists and turns of medieval politics and power struggles. A devout monk from the Kingdom of Naples, known for his simplicity and frugality, he rose to the papal throne in the midst of the Western Schism. But wait, there's a catch. Urban VI wasn't even a cardinal. After the death of Pope Gregory VI in 1378, a Roman mob surrounded the palace where a conclave was being held to demand a Roman pope be chosen, not another French puppet. Urban was unanimously chosen, and since he wasn't a cardinal, he wasn't well known, particularly to the mob. Most of the cardinals fled Rome after the conclave before the mob could discover that the new pope wasn't a Roman. Urban didn't exactly start off on the right foot. Instead of being the pliant pope they expected, he came out swinging. preaching fiery sermons about the excesses of the Curia and forbidding them from accepting gifts from rulers. He condemned the luxuries of their lives and their accumulation of titles and lands. In his opening address to the cardinals after his election, he allegedly yelled at one cardinal to shut up, called another a liar, a third a fool, and a fourth a bandit. Apparently, the whole speech was liberally sprinkled with insults and curses learned from growing up in the slums of Naples. He also refused to move to Avignon, ticking off King Charles V of France. The previous 7 popes had all lived there, and the French took this as a grave insult. The French cardinals decided they had enough of Urban and his judginess. They declared his election invalid and excommunicated him. To add insult to injury, they went ahead and elected their own pope, Clement VII, kicking off the infamous Western Schism that divided Catholics until 1417. Urban's patroness, Queen Joan I of Naples, withdrew her support and backed Clement as the rightful pope. Urban reasonably responded by excommunicating her and permitted a crusade to be preached against her.
Mark my words, when you least expect it, your uppance will come.
Joan's cousin Charles III swoops in, becomes King of Naples, and promptly executes Joan. Meanwhile, Urban found himself besieged at Castel St. Angelo and fled Rome, going to Naples to harass Charles in person for help taking back Rome. Instead, Charles imprisoned him in Nocera. Urban pulled off a daring escape to Genoa with the help of 2 Neapolitan barons. A few cardinals who had been in Nocera with him proposed that Council of Regency should be formed that would rule for Urban. Urban responded by having these audacious cardinals brutally tortured and killed. During a procession, Urban fell off his mule and died soon after, likely from injuries from it. Antipope Clement outlived Urban by 7 years and was bitterly disappointed when, after Urban's death, the conclave didn't recognize him as the only legitimate pope. Instead, the Roman conclave elected Boniface IX. It would have been so easy to end the schism by just recognizing that Boniface was already pope, but the French held their own conclave in 1394 when Clement died and elected Antipope Benedict XIII. Insanity.
You make me sad.
Next, we move on to perhaps the most infamous of the bad popes, Pope Alexander VI, aka Rodrigo Borgia. When you think of a pope, you probably think of a figure draped in robes, radiating humility and devoting his life to the faith. But Alexander VI was hardly a typical pope. In fact, his papacy from 1492 to 1503 is infamous for being one of the most scandalous in history, filled with corruption, nepotism, and a remarkable disregard for traditional papal virtues. Born in 1431 in the Kingdom of Valencia, Spain, Rodrigo Borgia was always destined for power, thanks to the advantages of family connections. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, had risen to become Pope Calixtus III in 1455, providing Rodrigo with his golden ticket to climb the church's hierarchy. And climb he did, with a ruthless determination that had less to do with piety and more to do with ambition, wealth, and political maneuvering. Calixtus III appointed Rodrigo to several lucrative and powerful positions within the church, including that of cardinal and vice-chancellor. This gave him access to immense wealth and influence, both of which Rodrigo leveraged with aplomb. Rodrigo's wealth wasn't simply a byproduct of his office, it was an instrument of his power. He used bribes and lavish gifts to secure alliances both inside and outside of the church. His ambitions were no secret to anyone, but they became undeniable in 1492 when he ascended to the papacy. The conclave that elected him was itself marred by accusations of simony, with Rodrigo allegedly buying the support of several cardinals. Alexander VI's blatant neglect of the spiritual inheritance of the church in favor of political maneuvering and personal gain contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment among the faithful and within the broader Christian community. This disillusionment did not go unnoticed and became a critical factor in the lead-up to the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation, which would begin in earnest just a few decades after Alexander VI's death, was driven by figures like Martin Luther, who challenged the church's authority and questioned its practices. The Protestant Reformation was in part a reaction to the very corruption and moral decline that Rodrigo Borgia epitomized. Discrediting of the church's moral authority during his papacy fueled calls for reform and contributed to the broader movement seeking to address the church's failures. Now, when we talk about the Borgia family, it's impossible not to mention nepotism. Alexander was more than a pope. He was the patriarch of the Borgia dynasty, and he shamelessly used his position to enrich and empower his children. His son, Cesare Borgia, perhaps the most famous of Rodrigo's offspring, was a ruthless military leader whose ambition was as boundless as his father's. Alexander made sure Cesare was appointed as a cardinal at the ripe age of 18, despite the fact that Cesare had no intention of actually serving the church. Later, when Cesare decided to abandon the church for a more fitting role as a military leader, Rodrigo threw his full support behind him, offering him wealth, land, and papal military support. Cesare went on to conquer various territories in Italy, attempting to carve out his own dominion under his father's patronage. This wasn't exactly a father-son bonding project you'd find in most families, but the Borgias were anything but ordinary. And then there was Lucrezia Borgia, Rodrigo's daughter, whose name has become synonymous with intrigue, poison, and scandal, though in many ways history has been less kind to her than she deserves. Alexander used Lucrezia as a pawn in his political games, arranging a series of strategic marriages that aligned with the family's shifting political alliances. She was married off to Giovanni Sforza, the powerful lord of Pesaro, but when the Borgias no longer needed the Sforza alliance, Rodrigo had the marriage annulled. He then married her to Alfonso of Aragon, a match that aligned with his ambitions in Naples. When that union also became politically inconvenient, Alfonso mysteriously ended up dead. Many suspect he was murdered on Cesare's orders. Lucrezia would marry again, each time serving her father's grand political strategy. So, what did Pope Alexander do with his own power while he was orchestrating the fates of his children? Well, let's just say he didn't exactly live like a monk. Pope Alexander VI was known for his extravagant lifestyle. He held lavish feasts, hosted decadent parties, and surrounded himself with courtiers more interested in political scheming than religious devotion. The Vatican during his papacy was far from a bastion of holiness. It became notorious for corruption and excess. Some of the most infamous stories involve the so-called Banquet of the Chestnuts, an event where 50 prostitutes entertained guests at the Vatican. Although it is debated whether the event actually happened as described, it still says something about the rumors swirling around Alexander VI's court. But Alexander was more than just a master of hedonism. He was also a skilled politician, deeply enmeshed in the intricate web of Italian and European politics. During his reign, Italy was a fractured and contested land, with the powerful city-states of Florence, Milan, and Venice vying for supremacy alongside foreign powers like France and Spain. Alexander deftly navigated these waters, forming and breaking alliances as needed to maintain the church's influence and secure his family's future. His dealings with the French king Charles VIII are a prime example of his political prowess. When Charles invaded Italy in 1494, Alexander initially opposed him, but quickly shifted his stance when he realized he could negotiate a better deal for himself and Cesare. While other rulers may have balked at switching sides, Alexander did what was necessary to protect his power, and, of course, that of his children. Though his actions scandalized Europe, Alexander also played a significant role in shaping the papacy's temporal power. Under his leadership, the papal states were consolidated, and the church's influence in Italy grew stronger. His legacy is complex. On one hand, he embodied the corruption and moral decay that so many associate with Renaissance popes. But on the other hand, he was also a shrewd leader who understood that the church's power extended far beyond the spiritual realm. He wasn't just concerned with saving souls. He was concerned with securing political dominance. In the end, Alexander's papacy came to a dramatic conclusion. His health began to decline, and in 1503 he died under mysterious circumstances. Some speculate that he was poisoned, a fitting end given the many plots and schemes that had defined his life. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Borgia's power, as the family's influence rapidly unraveled without Rodrigo at the helm. Cesare's military ventures crumbled, and Lucrezia retreated into relative obscurity in Ferrara. Yet the Borgia name endures, synonymous with corruption, ambition, and the darker side of Renaissance politics. He and his family will definitely get their own episode. There's just too much more to talk about with them. Next up, Leo X. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, assumed the papal throne in 1513. His papacy, though marked by an impressive patronage of the arts and flamboyant lifestyle, is often remembered for its scandals and its role in precipitating the Protestant Reformation. Leo X was renowned for his opulent taste and extravagant expenditures. His lavish spending on the arts and architecture, while contributing to the Renaissance's golden age, was criticized for prioritizing material excess over spiritual responsibilities. Leo's patronage was instrumental in commissioning works from Michelangelo and Raphael, enhancing the artistic and cultural prestige of the Vatican. However, this opulence came at a steep price, contributing to a growing financial crisis within the church. The biggest scandal during Leo X's papacy was the sale of indulgences. The indulgences were sold as a means to raise funds for the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a project that Leo was keen to advance. This practice, wherein individuals could purchase forgiveness for their sins or the sins of their loved ones, was perceived as a gross abuse of church authority. The sale of indulgences became a focal point of Martin Luther's protest against the Catholic Church, marking the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's 95 Theses, famously nailed to the door of Wittenberg Castle's church in 1517, challenged the very foundation of indulgence sales and questioned the church's authority. Leo X's dismissal of Luther, initially as a mere troublemaker, failed to address the deeper grievances that Luther's critiques represented. Instead of reforming the church's practices, Leo's reaction was to excommunicate Luther, which only intensified the Reformation movement and led to a significant schism within Christianity. Leo X's handling of the Reformation controversy further marred his failure to adopt meaningful reforms within the church. His focus on maintaining the church's financial and political power, rather than addressing the genuine spiritual and doctrinal issues raised by reformers, exemplifies his neglect of the church's spiritual mission. Leo X's papacy thus stands as a vivid example of how the intersection of personal ambition, financial mismanagement, and institutional neglect can precipitate far-reaching historical consequences. And there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the most scandalous popes in history, where holy robes and moral authority took a back seat to extravagance, nepotism, and a dash of good old-fashioned drama. Who knew that the Vatican had its own version of a reality TV show, complete with outrageous antics and headline-grabbing controversies? From turning the papal office into a family business, to setting off religious reformations with poorly timed fundraising campaigns, these historical figures proved that even though those with the highest calling can sometimes stumble into a mess of their own making. So next time you find yourself in a tight spot or facing an unexpected fiasco, just remember, at least you're not a 16th century pope trying to juggle church politics, financial crises, and the occasional Inquisition. As we wrap up our dive into these papal blunders, let's give a nod to the fact that while the Vatican's history may have been scandalous, it certainly makes for some of the most entertaining reading. Who knew the road to sainthood could be filled with so many detours? Thank you very much to the books Absolute Monarchs by John Julius Norwich, Sex Lives of the Popes by Nigel Crawthorne, and The Bad Popes by E.R. Chamberlain for all the research help as well as the countless websites I've hit up for information. I hope to have you turn in next episode. I'm considering talking about the Borgias in more detail. You can find me on my Facebook page, ADHD History, and on Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and YouTube at It's ADHD History. See you next time.